Uh, when I was a baby, my dad was part of a local softball team, a typical group of guys who bonded over beers and pizza after their games. It was a social thing, a way for fathers to unwind while their families mingled together. My parents were especially close with two other couples, each with young children, making it a lively affair whenever they got together. One hot summer evening, after an exciting game filled with laughter and friendly competition, my parents planned to join their friends at one of their homes for a post-game celebration. The kids were left with a babysitter who was splitting the evening with the other couple's babysitter. My parents were looking forward to it. It was one of those nights where everyone felt a little too carefree, a little too happy. But that night, I was being fussy. No matter how much my mom rocked me or how many lullabies my dad sang, I wouldn't settle down. My parents exchanged worried glances, debating whether to leave me with the babysitter or take me along. Eventually, my mom, sensing my distress, made the call to skip the gathering. "Let's just head home," she said, and my dad agreed, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. What I didn't know at the time was that my fussiness saved our lives. Later that night, the other couples arrived at the house they had chosen for the celebration. They settled in, the air filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, but their merriment would soon turn into a nightmare. While my parents were at home, feeling a mix of relief and guilt for missing out on the fun, the families at the house were blissfully unaware of the danger lurking just outside. Two men dressed in dark clothing had been watching the house for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were ruthless and desperate, fueled by a chilling need for money, and they saw this night as their opportunity. When the parents returned, the door creaked open and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The babysitter was tied up in the living room along with her boyfriend, and the children were huddled together, eyes wide with terror. The intruders had made their move, storming in before anyone realized what was happening. The scene was chaotic. The men shouted commands, their voices laced with anger and aggression. They bound the babysitter and her boyfriend, leaving them helpless on the floor. The children, terrified, were instructed to stay quiet, but they were mere babies, innocent and scared, unsure of what was happening. The men demanded the bopper and the fathers were forced into their own cars at gunpoint. They had no choice but to obey, their hearts pounding with fear for their children's safety. The men made them drive to a nearby bank, a grocery store, and one father was even made to go to the bank where he worked, clearing out accounts and emptying safes. The weight of the situation was suffocating, each stop feeling like a descent deeper into hell. Back at the house, the babysitter could hear the muffled cries of the children and the sounds of footsteps moving about. The tension hung thick in the air, wrapping around everyone like a vice. She knew that something was terribly wrong, that these men weren't just there to steal. Once the men had taken everything they wanted, they returned to the house, but what happened next was unfathomable. The fathers were forced back inside, their hearts racing, desperate to protect their families. But the intruders had no intention of leaving witnesses. In a horrific turn of events, they slaughtered the babysitter, her boyfriend, and the families, the chaos unfolding in a manner that would haunt the neighborhood for years to come. The children, those sweet, innocent lives, had no chance. While my parents sat in our living room, the weight of the world resting heavily on their shoulders, they were blissfully unaware of the horror that unfolded just miles away. The news the next day shattered the community. Grief swept through like a dark cloud, turning the once vibrant neighborhood into a place of fear. My father attended the trials, his heart heavy with the knowledge that they had come so close to joining the victims. He often spoke about how that experience changed him, how it was the first time he had considered supporting the death penalty. As the trial progressed, the true nature of the two men emerged. They were cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of remorse. Hearing the testimonies of survivors and the accounts of those who were left behind was devastating. Every detail painted a vivid picture of horror, and my father felt an overwhelming chill when he realized how close our family had come to that fate. In the years that followed, our lives returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of that night never left us. There were nights when I would wake up to my parents whispering, the fear lingering in their voices. I could sense it even as a child, the unspoken terror that had settled in our home. Sometimes I would hear my mother recount how my fussiness had saved our lives, a shiver running down her spine as she said it. If you hadn't been so fussy, we would have been there, she would say, shaking her head as if trying to erase the horror of the thought. In the end, we were spared from that gruesome fate, but the community was forever marked by the tragedy. The soft laughter that once echoed through the neighborhood was replaced by cautious whispers and wary glances. No one spoke about the incident lightly. It was a darkness that hovered just beneath the surface. Years later, as I grew older, I learned more about that fateful night. I discovered that life can shift in an instant, and sometimes the smallest things can lead to the greatest outcomes. My father often emphasized how every decision, no matter how insignificant, can have monumental consequences. But as I looked back on that night, I realized it wasn't just about my fussiness. It was about luck, chance, and the cruel unpredictability of life. In a world that can turn dark in a heartbeat, we had narrowly escaped. It's a reminder that sometimes the horrors of the night are only a breath away, and the people we love are always worth protecting, no matter the cost. In the summer of 1904, the small town of Cincinnati was filled with excitement. The air buzzed with the sounds of children laughing and playing, and the scent of blooming flowers wafted through the streets. It was a time of innocence, with girls in white dresses twirling on the lawns and boys racing down the cobblestone streets. But for the students of the local school, summer meant a break from lessons, and they would often gather in the schoolyard to play and explore. One particular day, the sun shone brightly as the schoolgirls, all aged around 11 or 12, decided to have a picnic near their school. They spread out a colorful blanket beneath the shade of an old oak tree, filling the air with giggles and excitement as they unpacked their lunches. The laughter echoed around the schoolyard, a happy sound that resonated with the warmth of summer. As the day wore on, they grew restless. Their laughter turned into games of tag, their dresses swirling as they dashed across the schoolyard. As the sun reached its peak, they ventured further, chasing one another and climbing the wooden structures of the old school, which had been there for generations. They were oblivious to the dangers lurking nearby. The old schoolhouse had an outhouse situated at the far end of the playground, a structure that had seen better days. Its wooden walls were weathered and the floorboards creaked with age. The girls had often joked about the outhouse, daring each other to enter it, but today it seemed like a place of adventure. The mischievous glint in their eyes was enough to send them racing towards it, giggling as they decided to test their bravery. As they approached, the ground beneath their feet felt strange, as if the earth were shifting. Ignoring the unease that prickled at the back of their minds, they pushed open the rickety door, the hinges creaking ominously. Inside, the foul smell hit them like a wave, but they were determined to make a game of it. One by one, they peered into the dark pit, their giggles turning into shrieks of laughter as they teased each other about the horrors lurking below. But the excitement quickly turned to fear as the floorboards creaked ominously beneath their weight. They were so engrossed in their playful antics that they didn't notice the decay creeping beneath their feet. Without warning, the rotting wood beneath them splintered and gave way. The girls screamed as the floor collapsed, sending them plummeting into the dark abyss below. It happened in an instant. The sound of splintering wood echoed like thunder, and the air was filled with the smell of decay and filth. They fell into a pit filled with human waste, the putrid liquid engulfing them as they struggled to stay afloat. Panic surged through their hearts as they realized the horrifying truth. They were trapped in a nightmare. The cries for help rang out in the stillness of the summer air, but the schoolyard was deserted. The laughter from earlier faded into nothingness as the girls flailed in the muck, desperately trying to find something solid to grab onto. Their frantic movements only seemed to draw them deeper into the muck, the heavy stench choking them as they gasped for air. One of the girls, Mary, managed to cling to the edge of the collapsed floor, her fingers grasping desperately at the splintered wood. "Help! Someone help us!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. But her cries went unanswered, swallowed by the darkness surrounding them. The other girls struggled to find purchase, but the slippery sides of the pit offered no refuge. They were submerged in the filth, fighting against the overwhelming despair that threatened to pull them under. Mary's heart raced as she felt the weight of her friends drowning beside her, their hands reaching for her in desperation, but it was futile. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank into the vile depths. Minutes felt like hours as they fought against the rising tide of waste. The smell became unbearable, their screams muffled by the filth. Mary's lungs burned, and she felt herself slipping, her strength fading as despair threatened to consume her. It was then that she felt a tug at her arm. One of her friends, Sarah, was still holding on, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't let go," Mary shouted, her voice strained. But the weight of the waste was too much. One by one, her friends succumbed, their bodies growing limp as they struggled against the horrific reality closing in around them. In the town nearby, the clock struck the hour. The townsfolk continued about their day, blissfully unaware of the tragedy unfolding just a few blocks away. It was only later, when the school bell rang, that the teachers began to notice the absence of the girls. A sense of dread washed over the school when they realized the children hadn't returned from their picnic. A search party was quickly organized. The town's men and women fanned out, calling the girls' names, their voices echoing into the trees. The laughter that had once filled the air was replaced with an ominous silence, a palpable tension hanging over the group as they began to search the area. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon the collapsed outhouse, the stench of decay wafting through the air. Horror washed over them as they peered into the pit, their hearts sinking as they realized the grim fate that had befallen the girls. They quickly formed a human chain, desperately trying to reach into the darkness. One by one, they pulled the girls out, but it was too late. The vibrant laughter that had once filled the summer air was replaced with cries of anguish as the townsfolk realized they were too late. The girls had drowned in the filth, their bodies lifeless and cold. News of the tragedy spread like wildfire through Cincinnati. The story of the 9 schoolgirls who had perished in the outhouse became a cautionary tale, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The town mourned their loss, the empty playground echoing with memories of laughter and joy, now forever tainted by the darkness of that day. The outhouse was sealed off, left to rot in the memories of those who had witnessed the horror. But even as the years passed, whispers of the incident lingered, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the horrors that could unfold in the most unsuspecting places. And as the sun set each evening, casting long shadows over the town, the echoes of laughter seemed to fade, leaving behind only silence and the ghosts of the past. Nutty Putty Cave, a name that sounds almost whimsical, hides dark secrets beneath its surface. Located in Utah, it was a popular destination for spelunkers and adventure seekers. But for one family, the cave became a place of unimaginable horror. It was late November 2009 when John Jones, an eager 26-year-old medical student, and his friends decided to explore the depths of Nutty Putty. They had heard stories about the cave's narrow passages and breathtaking formations, but nothing could prepare them for the night's events. The group entered the cave around sunset, laughter echoing through the cold, damp air. The flickering beams of their headlamps danced across the walls, illuminating the intricate patterns of rock formations. After an hour of exploring, they stumbled upon a narrow passageway called the Birth Canal. It was aptly named for its tight confines, but the thrill of the challenge drew John in. He squeezed his way into the opening, ignoring the flicker of apprehension in his gut. As he navigated the twisting tunnel, the sound of his friends faded behind him, swallowed by the cave's shadows. The walls closed in around him, and John felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. He reached a point where he had to turn around, but when he tried to back out, he realized he was stuck. Panic surged through him as he twisted and squirmed, trying to find a way back. It was no use. The walls felt like they were pressing down on him. He called out for help, but his friends, unaware of the depth of his struggle, were still exploring farther along. Time passed in a blur of panic and desperation. John's heart raced as he felt the weight of the cave around him. His position had him trapped upside down, blood rushing to his head, a sense of dread wrapping around him like a vice. He fought against the darkness creeping into the corners of his mind, the cold touch of fear clawing at him. Finally, his friends realized something was wrong. They retraced their steps, and when they found John, his body was wedged in a small crevice, his face pale and drenched in sweat. They tried to pull him free, but every attempt only made the situation worse. It wasn't long before they realized they needed help. One of them scrambled back to the cave entrance, shouting for assistance. Rescue teams arrived, their headlamps cutting through the darkness like tiny beacons of hope. They assessed the situation, but the reality was grim. John had been trapped for hours, and the blood had drained from his legs, leaving them cold and lifeless. Every passing minute deepened the sense of urgency, but the cave was unforgiving. As they worked to free him, the reality of the situation set in. The only way to extract John from the crevice was to break his legs, a move that would likely send him into shock. The rescuers faced an impossible choice: risk his life in the hopes of saving him, or leave him trapped. The sound of machinery echoed in the cave as they struggled to devise a plan. John, meanwhile, was fading. The world around him grew quieter, his cries for help becoming weaker. After 28 agonizing hours, the decision was made. They attempted to extract him. The snapping of bone filled the cave, mingling with John's agonized screams. But it was too late. He was already slipping away, the darkness closing in around him. John Jones died in that cave, leaving his friends and family devastated. In the wake of his death, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed, forever keeping John's body in the depths below. The cave that once drew adventurers now stood as a tomb, a reminder of the horror that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly innocent places. Visitors would tell stories of John, the man who became a ghost in the cave, warning others of the dangers that could hide in tight spaces, where a moment of excitement could lead to unimaginable terror. Years passed, and the legend of Nutty Putty Cave grew. It became a place of cautionary tales, a spot where thrill seekers were reminded of the fragility of life and the perilous nature of adventure. Though the entrance was sealed, the haunting stories of John Jones echoed through the minds of those who heard them, a grim reminder of how quickly fun can turn into horror on the highway of life, or in this case, in the dark, twisting passages of a cave. Summer of 1978, the air was thick with humidity, a typical day in California. 15-year-old Mary Vincent stood at the edge of the highway, the hot asphalt radiating heat beneath her bare feet. With her backpack slung over her shoulder, she was hoping to hitch a ride to see her friends, yearning for the kind of freedom that only youth can bring. The sun was high, and her spirit was light, unaware of the darkness lurking just around the corner. As cars whizzed by, she felt the thrill of possibility. Who would pick her up? What adventures lay ahead? Suddenly, a beige van slowed down, the window rolling down to reveal a man with a friendly smile. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice warm and inviting. Mary hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of intuition whispering in her mind. But the allure of escape from the oppressive heat and the chance for adventure overcame her caution. She nodded and climbed into the passenger seat, blissfully unaware that this decision would alter the course of her life forever. The man introduced himself as Lawrence Singleton. He seemed harmless at first, chatting casually as they drove down the highway. Mary felt a fleeting sense of relief, laughing at his jokes and sharing stories about her life. But as they turned off the main road and onto a secluded side street, a knot of unease began to twist in her stomach. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh, just a little detour," he replied, a hint of something sinister creeping into his tone. Panic washed over her as the landscape grew more desolate, trees pressing in on either side, swallowing the van in shadows. "Can you let me out?" Mary's heart raced as she realized the gravity of her mistake. She reached for the door handle, but Singleton's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his demeanor shifting as he glanced at her. "We're not done yet, sweetheart." Mary's instincts screamed at her to escape. She knew she had to get out, and she had to do it fast. In an instant, she flung open the door and bolted, sprinting into the thick underbrush. Adrenaline surged through her veins, her feet pounding against the ground, but she could hear Singleton's footsteps behind her, heavy and relentless. "Get back here," he shouted, rage lacing his voice. Mary's heart raced as she navigated the undergrowth, branches scratching at her skin. She could hear him getting closer, the snap of twigs echoing like thunder in her ears. Just when she thought she might lose him, she stumbled, crashing to the ground. Before she could regain her footing, she felt him grab her by the hair, dragging her back toward the van. In a horrific turn of events, Singleton pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the dappled sunlight. "You think you can run from me?" he spat, fury twisting his features. Mary's breath quickened as she realized the depth of his madness. He held her down, a monstrous figure looming over her, and with a brutal precision he cut off her arms just below the elbows, a horrifying scream escaping her lips. The pain was unimaginable, a white-hot blaze that consumed her, and then a numbness set in as shock began to take over. Singleton didn't stop there. He discarded her like trash, tossing her into a ravine and leaving her to die. The world faded around her, darkness closing in, but deep inside, a flicker of survival ignited. As she lay there, blood soaking into the earth, Mary packed her stumps with mud, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The night crept in, the stars shining down on her like distant witnesses to the horror she had endured. She couldn't give up. She wouldn't. With agonizing determination, she began to crawl. Each movement was excruciating, her body protesting against the pain, but she pressed on, fueled by the instinct to survive. Hours felt like days as she clawed her way through the rough terrain, the cold bite of fear urging her forward. Finally, as dawn broke, she reached the edge of the highway. A faint light flickered in the distance, and she gathered the last remnants of her strength to drag herself onto the pavement. Naked and covered in blood, she lay there, exposed and vulnerable, praying that someone would see her. The first car approached, a family vehicle gliding down the road. Mary raised her stumps, desperation etched across her face, but as the car neared, it swerved, tires screeching as the driver sped away in terror. Heartbroken, she sank into despair. Had she come this far only to be ignored? But then the second car appeared, a couple on their honeymoon, laughter bubbling between them. As they drew closer, Mary raised her arms again, fear etched across her face. This time they didn't hesitate. "Oh my God," the woman screamed, and the husband slammed on the brakes, jumping out of the car in a panic. They rushed to her side, their faces a mix of horror and concern. "We need to get you help," the man shouted, carefully lifting her into the car. As they sped away from that nightmare, the couple couldn't comprehend the depth of Mary's trauma. She struggled to stay conscious, the world spinning around her. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they raced toward safety. In the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save her life. The loss of blood and trauma left her fragile, but she was a warrior at heart. After hours of surgery and care, Mary woke up in a sterile room, the beeping of machines grounding her back to reality. The days that followed were filled with pain and healing. Each moment was a battle as she confronted the horror that had befallen her. But through it all, Mary found strength in her will to survive, refusing to be defined by what had happened to her. The story of her ordeal spread, becoming a rallying cry for survivors everywhere. She spoke out against violence and the injustices faced by so many, using her voice to advocate for change. The scars on her body became symbols of her resilience, her spirit unbroken. Though the highway she once stood on had turned into a path of darkness, it ultimately led her to a new life, one defined not by fear, but by hope. Mary Vincent emerged from the shadows, a beacon of strength for those still trapped in their own horrors. The journey was far from over, but she had found her voice, and it would never be silenced again. Summer day, the kind that soaked the city in a thick haze, leaving an oppressive heat that clung to our skin. My friends and I were 12, full of energy and that reckless bravado that comes with youth. We rode our bikes through the streets, laughing and challenging one another to outdo the last crazy stunt. We weren't thinking about consequences or safety. We were just kids having fun. That day, we decided to head to the abandoned subway station just a few blocks from our neighborhood. Rumors circulated about the place, tales of ghosts haunting the dimly lit tunnels and shadows lurking in the corners. It was thrilling to think about, and the allure of the forbidden drew us in like moths to a flame. We parked our bikes against the rusted railings outside and crept through the crumbling entrance. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and something else, something metallic that sent a shiver down my spine. We ventured deeper into the darkness, our flashlights flickering against the walls. Graffiti adorned the surfaces like wounds, each tag a mark left by the careless hands of previous explorers. As we moved further in, I felt a mix of excitement and dread. We whispered stories about what might be lurking in the shadows, each tale growing taller and more terrifying than the last. My heart raced, but I pushed the fear down, eager to impress my friends. Suddenly, my friend Ben, always the daredevil of our group, sprinted ahead. "Come on, guys, let's see how far we can get." His voice echoed through the corridor, filled with a bravado that masked his own fear. We followed him, our laughter mingling with the echoes, momentarily drowning out the sense of foreboding that had begun to creep in. Then, without warning, Ben tripped over an unseen obstacle, tumbling forward. The clatter of his bike hitting the ground resonated like a gunshot in the silence. In an instant, he fell onto the tracks that led down into the subway. I gasped, my stomach dropping as I watched him land face first onto the cold, metallic surface. "Ben!" I shouted, a mix of panic and horror flooding through me. The sight of him sprawled out, motionless, sent a chill down my spine. It felt like time stood still as we stood frozen in shock, unable to process what had just happened. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. Moments later, Ben stirred, lifting his head slightly. "Can I move?" he asked weakly, his voice strained. "Will I be electrocuted?" The reality of the third rail, the electrified line that powered the trains, hit me like a freight train. My mind raced as I remembered the countless warnings we had heard about it. "Get up! Move!" I yelled, my voice cracking with urgency. "Please, just get off the tracks!" He pushed himself up, and we all rushed forward, grabbing his arms and pulling him back. The relief of getting him away from the tracks was momentary. Dread clawed at my throat as I glanced back. No less than 2 minutes later, a deafening roar filled the air. The train came barreling through the dark tunnel, lights blazing, shaking the ground beneath us. We stood frozen in place, breathless and wide-eyed as it zipped past, a massive metallic beast that could have ended our friend's life in an instant. When the train finally passed, silence fell upon us. Ben was shaken, his face pale, but he was alive. I could see the adrenaline coursing through him, mingling with shock. "What the hell just happened?" he gasped, his voice trembling. We all stared at each other, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The thrill we had felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by a heavy weight of reality. "You could have died, man," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea how close you were." Ben let out a shaky laugh, trying to brush it off. "I'm fine. It's not a big deal," he insisted, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He glanced back at the tracks, and for the first time, I saw fear flash across his face. We stumbled out of the station, the oppressive heat of the day hitting us like a wall as we emerged into the sunlight. The laughter that had echoed moments before felt like a distant memory, replaced by an uneasy silence. The weight of our actions bore down on us. The thrill of adventure transformed into a chilling reminder of the fragility of life. As we gathered our bikes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within us. We were no longer just kids seeking adventure. We had faced a reality that was darker than any ghost story we could conjure. We rode home in silence, the sound of the tires on the pavement drowned out by the thudding of our hearts. That incident haunted me long after. I replayed it in my mind. The fear, the adrenaline, the stark realization of how quickly everything could change. It was a moment that reminded me of the thin line we tread between life and death, a line that felt all too fragile in that moment beneath the abandoned subway. Months passed, and summer faded into autumn, but the memory lingered. Whenever I passed by the old station, a shiver would run down my spine. I could still hear the rush of the train, the screams of my friends, and the dread of what might have been. The thrill of those childhood adventures faded, replaced by an acute awareness of danger, a shadow that would follow me as I grew older. Ben and I remained friends, but something was different. There was a bond forged in that moment, a shared understanding of the fragility of life. We found ourselves drawn to safer pursuits, avoiding the thrill of reckless adventures. Years later, we would look back on that day as a turning point, a moment when we learned that life isn't always a game. Beneath the laughter and the lightheartedness of childhood, there lurked a darkness that could emerge at any moment, a horror waiting on the edge of the tracks, ready to take what it wants if we weren't careful. And every time I heard the distant sound of a train, I felt that same chill. The reminder that life can change in an instant, that every moment is precious, and that horror can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest slip.